All right. This is our 15th lesson on the flood, and I'm hoping that we can finish it sometime in the fall. I don't think we can finish it before the summer begins, okay? But we'll just go until we finish the material and keep it recording. We're looking at chapter 6 of the book, and there are several questions we have to ask and answer. One question is, what was the nature of the antediluvian atmosphere? Now remember that ante is Latin for before, and diluvian is the flood. So what was the Earth's atmosphere like before the flood? The antediluvian atmosphere. Is there any biblical evidence, either implicit or explicit, that it was of a different nature than its present state? I believe the answer to that is yes, there was evidence. We'll set that forth. If the nature of the atmosphere were different, hypothetically, if it were different, what effects would this have on life forms? All types of life forms, plants and animals and humans as well. And so let's try to deal with that question. How would an atmosphere that was of the nature depicted by the scriptures, if the scriptures depict an atmosphere and get information about it, how would it affect mankind? How would it affect living organisms, particularly specifically humans? And that's another question. And is there scientific evidence that the antediluvian atmosphere was like that depicted in the scriptures? And again, I say implicitly depicted in the scriptures, okay? Is it possible for the present atmosphere to return to the state of the antediluvian atmosphere? So that's another question we were asking. Is that possible? Is the earth, is it capable of getting back to that state? Right? Look at Genesis 1:6 through 8. And God said that there be a firmament in the midst of the waters, and that it divide the waters from the waters. God made the firmament and divided the waters which were under the firmament from the waters which were above the firmament. And it was so. And God called the firmament heaven. There was evening, there was morning, a second day. We're not going to get into the creation itself per se, but we will look at the term firmament. What is this firmament in the midst of the waters? And the sea divided the waters from the waters. And the firmament was divided, the waters which were under the firmament from the waters which were above the firmament. That's the dividing of the waters. And so right here, there's waters above the firmament and waters below the firmament. So what in the world is the firmament that he's talking about? What he tells us here, and God called the firmament heaven. So now the firmament is called heaven. And again, we're looking at what the Bible says, strictly what the scriptures say. And of course, there was evening and morning the second day. I take the days to be roughly 24 hours, maybe a minute off here or there, but 24-hour days essentially. Might have been 24 hours and 2 seconds, or we're not going to quibble about stuff like that. But they're 24-hour days, what I'll call them, okay? Now, any questions or comments about the firmament? So there's waters above and waters below the firmament, whatever the firmament is, and he calls the firmament heaven.
Question? Marion,
yes.
I'm sorry, Marion. I'm looking at you. Am I supposed to be seeing you?
No, you're supposed to be seeing my slide. Everybody else just seeing me?
I see a slide.
As do I. I see the slide.
Okay. I'll go out and come back in.
Okay. All right.
Thank you.
Well, I'm not as good looking as the slide, so you need to see the slide. Hopefully we're recording the slides, okay?
There we go.
I'll pause a moment, let him get back in. But,
okay, I got it.
All right. Let's look at the word firmament, rakia. So we have rakia, and that's extended surface or solid expanse, as if beaten out. Brown, Driver, Briggs, Gesenius, Hebrew Chaldee Lexicon, page 956. I have dyslexia, so I reverse numbers sometimes. I really do. It's a problem. So I know people will say now, we know what's wrong with Marion. The footnote in the American Standard Version is expanse. That's the American Standard footnote, so that helps us a bit. It's an expanse. The Hebrew word, rakia again, rakia. Here are the places it's found. Now, if you're watching this on the internet, you can pause it and read these passages and study them out for yourself. We're not going to look at all these passages, but we'll look at some of them. But these are all the places it's found in the Old Testament. And so the Hebrew word is found. Of course, we already looked at Genesis 1, 6, 7, and 8. All right, so now we'll look at some other passages, some of them here. God called the firmament heaven. He called it heaven. Now, how is the word heaven in the Bible? Most of the time, the word heaven is in the plural. Occasionally, it's in the singular, but it's in the plural in both the Hebrew and the Greek. Because in the Bible, there's at least 3 heavens, and I think by implication, at least 4. There was evening, morning, and a second day. We've already looked at this verse. The sky is in Genesis 7:23 is referred to as heaven. And every living thing was destroyed, which was going to face the ground. This is during the flood. Both man and cattle and creeping things and birds of the heavens. See, the birds of the heavens. Notice plural. And they were destroyed from the earth, and Noah only was left, and they that were left with him in the ark. So the birds of the heavens, it's where the birds fly. It's called heaven in sense. And now notice it's plural. And so again, we have the birds flying in the heavens. Well, the firmament itself is called heaven. See, the firmament, God called the firmament heaven, and the birds fly in the heavens. Okay. Now, sometimes, as we see here, it refers to where the birds fly, and this is called the first heaven. All right. And sometimes it refers to space, where the sun, moon, and stars are. We use that in English. And that's would be heaven and the heaven. This would be your second heaven, I believe. Sometimes it refers to paradise, the word heaven does. And this is called the third heaven. Now, we'll get some scripture for that in just a minute. Sometimes it refers to the abode of the Lord, where God dwells. And this would be the fourth heaven, although it's not explicitly called the fourth heaven. But it's a different place than what we call paradise here. We'll show that in a minute. Questions or comments? All right, let's go to 2 Corinthians 12:2. Paul says, I know a man in Christ. Most commentators think he's talking about himself. I think it may have been when he was stoned and then was raised from the dead, rose up after that. I think he may have died and then the Lord raised him back. That's a theory I have. I know a man in Christ 14 years ago. That's about the right time for when he was stoned. Whether in the body I know not, or whether out of the body I know not, God knoweth. Such a one caught up even to the third heaven. So now this one that he knows, and again, most commentators think he's talking about himself, caught up to the third heaven and the paradise. That's where a person goes when they die. A righteous person goes to paradise, and an unrighteous person goes to Tartarus, goes to Hades, Tartarus. And I know such a man within the body, apart from the body, I know not, God knoweth. Verse 4, how that he was caught up into paradise and heard unspeakable words, which is not lawful for them man to utter. Now notice, he's caught up to the third heaven, but he's caught up to paradise. So where was he caught up to? Third heaven, which is called paradise. Use the term paradise for where he was caught up to, which he also calls it the third heaven. Question or comments? All right, here's my slide that shows the abode of people. During this life, the good people and the evil people are separated by a gulf. The gulf that separates them is their character. At death, our fate is sealed at that time. There's no changing after that. The righteous people go to paradise. This place of the where all the dead go is called Hades in the New Testament. In the Greek, the abode of the dead, or Sheol is the Hebrew term that's used. Now, these two are equated in Acts 2. In Acts 2:27, the Hebrew Sheol is quoted by Peter, and he uses the word Hades in the place of Sheol. So they're equated here as the same thing. And so Hades or Sheol, and it's called third heaven, paradise. And this is where in Luke 16, Luke 23, Luke 16 is Lazarus and the rich man. I don't think it's a parable. I think it's actually an event, but that we're not going to worry about that right now. Luke 23:43, a thief on the cross. Today shalt thou be with me in paradise. Jesus, according to Acts 2, went to Hades, and we know he went to paradise. So paradise is part of Hades here where Jesus went. And of course, in Psalm 16:10, we find it as well. That's quoted in Acts 2. 2 Peter 2:4, it's called Tartarus. That's where the wicked people go. And so there's a fixed gulf according to Lazarus and the rich man in the event of Acts 16:19 through 31. And he can't pass from one side to the other. So you cannot go across. You can go across over here during your life. You can change from being evil to being good. Hopefully people do that and repent and obey the gospel and become Christians. Some people can go into apostasy and become from good to evil too. So a person can lose their soul. But right here, the third heaven is in 2 Corinthians. This is it here. And it's also called the abyss, Romans 10:7. Now at the judgment day, Hades is cast into the lake of fire. Revelation 20 is destroyed. Gehenna is the lake of fire. And so this is what we would call hell. Now the King James calls Hades hell, but the American Standard, most other translations translate it as Hades. That's two different words. And so those in paradise at the judgment, then they enter into heaven to stay forever. And those in Tartarus, the state of punishment, then are then cast into the lake of fire. Are there questions? This is my slide for that, depicting it. I have some sermons that I preach on that. Any questions?
Yes, God does not do anything wasteful, and he's going to create a new heaven and a new earth. What would be the purpose of the new earth?
Well, the new heaven and the new earth is probably a figure of speech. And so it will be, most likely it's referring to the church. Okay. Now, in the church in this life will the new heavens and new earth will come as a figure, and it's just talking about heaven itself, I think. I don't think it's actually creating the earth again. I think it's a figure of speech.
Okay, thank you.
I don't know that I'm right on that, but that's my conclusion. All right. All right. Let's go back to the theories about the waters above the firmament now. The firmament is where the birds fly, and it's called heaven. It could be one of these four things: where the birds fly, it could be where the sun, moon, and stars are. It could be where souls go at death, and which is a spiritual realm, and that doesn't make any sense. So that doesn't help. Could be the heaven where God dwells. And that doesn't make any sense either. So it has to be either where the birds fly, the firmament here is, or it has to be where the sun, moon, the stars are out in space. Well, that doesn't make much sense either. So I would argue then my first theory is the waters above the firmament were oceans, and the waters below the firmament were subterranean waters. That's one theory that some people hold. They say the firmament was the oceans, and the waters above were the oceans, and the waters below are subterranean waters. This is one of the views on the flood that some people hold, that there was water under the surface of the earth. But this firmament doesn't fit into where the birds are flying, because that would be the surface of the earth itself. So again, it doesn't fit in very well with what we see how the firmament's described. The birds are flying in the firmament of heaven. Okay. So I think this is one of the theories. There's some books that have been written on this, and there's some people that are striving to understand what the Bible says. And I'm not going to get in a tussle with them, an argument with them, but I'm trying to set forth what I think is the best, most reasonable explanation of the flood. That's what this is all about. All right. So I reject that first theory. The second theory is the waters above the firmament was a water vapor canopy, and the waters below are the subterranean waters. Well, that's a theory. I go with the first part of it, water vapor canopy, but subterranean waters, I don't go with that. Again, there are those that claim that water spewed out of the earth itself and covered the earth, and then it went back into the earth. So the flood occurred because of that. My view is that there's not enough sufficient evidence to support that. It has several problems. Water that deep in the core of the earth, it would be very hot as well. It would be extremely hot water, okay, like geysers. The third theory is that the waters above the firmament are waters above the sky. They exist in some state other than water vapor. Okay, that's your third theory. All right, so they exist in some state other than water vapor. Of course, water only exists there. There are four natural states of matter. We'll get to those in a minute. But those four natural states are a liquid, a solid, liquid, a vapor, gas, and then a plasma. Of course, I don't think water, I think in a plasma state, it's so hot, I think it would break down the molecules of water, but I'm not sure about that. So water exists in basically three states. It has to be extremely hot to get a plasma, form of plasma. The fourth theory, which will be considered, is that the waters above the firmament exist in the form of water vapor. And the waters below the firmament are the oceans. That's my view. That's the view I hold. That it was water vapor in the upper atmosphere, and the waters below the firmament were the oceans themselves. Questions or comments? Now, the first theory neglects the point that Moses defined the firmament as heaven. He defined it as heaven, and that won't fit, because if it's the water in the ocean, and then that's the top of it, and the bottom of it is subterranean waters, it doesn't fit this definition of the firmament being heaven, because the oceans are not anywhere above the heavens, okay, above anything that's called heaven in the Bible, okay. So that won't fit, and so I reject that view because of this passage. And to me, that's sufficient to reject it. The first theory neglects the fact that Moses also stated that the birds fly in the firmament. Now, if the waters above the firmament were the oceans, the birds are flying below the oceans. They're flying in that firmament. Now, I know penguins, in a sense, fly, but we're stretching it. That's a big stretch to get that. And God said that the waters swarm with swarms of living creatures, and that the birds fly above the earth in the open firmament of heaven. So that's where the birds are flying, in the open firmament of heaven. I just can't see it, that this firmament being the waters above the firmament being the oceans, and the waters below being subterranean waters. I don't think it'll fit at all. Other questions or comments about that? I have a book that starts with that premise, and I reject the premise because of these scriptures that we've given here. Okay. Second theory claims that subterranean waters were the source of the fountains of the great deep. Now, this is a view held by several people. So there's a number of people who hold that view. And they go to Genesis 7, 11, and 8 too. In the 600th year of Noah's life, the second month, on the 17th day of the month, on the same day were all the fountains of the great deep broken up, and the windows of heaven were opened. So now what we find is the fountains of the great deep were broken up. Windows of heaven are opened. So the windows of heaven, notice windows plural of heaven. We'll get back to that later. And the 600th year of his life, fountains of the deep. Now, so they say, okay, the deep, it has to be down in the earth itself. No, because the word deep is used most of the time for the ocean itself. And so I want to set forth that the fountains of the deep were waters coming out of the oceans. We'll set that forth as we develop this flood model. Windows of heaven, and we have, I believe there's three mechanisms for the flood. And one of them is the fountains of the deep, which would be the deep is the oceans. And then the second one is the windows of heaven. And the third one is the rain from the waters above the firmament. I think there are three mechanisms. We'll get to them later. We won't worry about them right now, but I will postulate three mechanisms. Right? Any questions? One of the problems with the second theory is that there's no mechanism to pull the waters back into the core of the earth after the flood. How did they get back in? And so that's a problem with that. And of course, the waters coming out of the earth itself would be very hot. I know when they drill deep out in the western part of Oklahoma, they drill some oil and gas wells over 20,000 feet deep, and the rock gets very, very hot at that depth. It's up several hundred degrees Fahrenheit. And so this would make the water very, very hot if it's spewed out of the core of the earth or any depth at all in the earth itself. That's a problem with it. How to get back in? Where'd the water go? The atheists make fun of the flood and say, "Who drained the pond?" is their view. Well, my model doesn't have to worry about draining the pond. All right, it's taken care of. There's no evidence that there was ever extensive amounts of water under the crust of the earth. Now, I know there's water that we get from wells and other subterranean waters, but not enough to cover the mountains, 20, 30,000 feet high mountains. Okay, right? Just not enough there. Water exists in three basic states in nature. There is a fourth state, but these are solid, liquid, and vapor. And these are your three basic states in nature. If waters above the firmament were water vapor, that must be, or not water vapor, they must be either liquid water or solid water. I don't know that we have plasma water, so I'm not going to worry about that. There is a fourth state of nature, but plasma is one of those. If it's not water vapor, it's either liquid or solid, which would be ice. For water to exist above the sky in any form except as a water vapor would require that it actually be in orbit around the earth. So if we have it as ice, it would have to be in orbit. Otherwise, the gravity would pull it down. Liquid water as well would do that. If it's up real high, it gets pretty cold up in space, so it would freeze. So we'd have freezing. Of course, we know that comets stay in the form of ice. They get close to the sun, however, they will melt, but they'll refreeze pretty quickly. So if it exists above the sky, it has to be one of these three forms. It doesn't make any sense for it to be liquid or solid. And so liquid water or solid water ice, H2O ice. All right. First state, of course, is the solid. The second is liquid. And the third is a vapor or gas. Fourth state is the plasma, but it has to get extremely hot to form a plasma. I just can't see the plasma state existing and being a credible possibility. There is a fifth state, and actually the Bose-Einstein condensates Actually, I think they come up with 20 different states, most, and they're all man-made in some kind of nuclear reactions. So I took my first graduate course in physics in 1962, and when I was 18 years old, and so they didn't talk about some of this stuff in that class. I think this stuff has been they come up with this since that time. But I'm kind of out of date a bit on some of that, right? But the first four states are nature, and the other ones are man-made states, okay? The third theory would have the water above the atmosphere and would exist in the form of ice, such as the rings of Saturn. That's what we'd have to have. And of course, that's a possibility. It leaves one with more questions than answers, however. It creates a lot of problems for us. But that's a possibility. There is one theory that the Earth was surrounded by like a glass hydrogen dome around the Earth before the flood. And it was like frozen hydrogen. That's one theory. I don't hold to it, but I've read where one guy holds that view. All right. The fourth theory is that the waters above the firmament exist in the form of water vapor, and the waters below were the ocean. That's my position. That's the position that I hold to as we look at this. All right. So as we look further, water vapor is lighter than air. The H2O molecule has a molecular weight that's about 53% of the average molecular weight of O2, which is oxygen. Most oxygen exists. Now, that's the oxygen molecule. So if you take the number of particles in the nucleus, just kind of leave off the electrons, which they don't contribute much, and you just add them together and you get this ratio. And it's about the 58.7% the average molecular weight of air itself. So air, including all of the gases in the atmosphere. About 21% of the atmosphere is oxygen, about 78% is nitrogen, and that leaves about 1% being other gases like argon, neon, and krypton, and other gases. Questions or comments? And of course, there's carbon dioxide, and there is, of course, water vapor in the atmosphere. So water vapor it's less dense, it weighs less than oxygen and the other gases in the atmosphere, main gases. So it tends to rise up. Right? Water vapor would rise above most of the atmosphere because of its density. The least dense rises and the more dense settles to the bottom. That's the way things work. And so what we have at this present time, there is some water vapor in the stratosphere of the atmosphere. And there's not a lot, but there's water vapor up there. Now we'll see what happened with water vapor. This is the theory that is the most reasonable, that harmonizes with both the scriptures and the facts of nature and the laws of science, as I see things. Are there questions or comments?
During the flood,
Yes.
with the water rising thousands of feet, I guess, then did that push the all atmosphere up to a higher level? And right now, if you're on Mount Everest, for example, you would be barely able to breathe, and it's very dangerous for your health. You see my question?
Yes.
How does? Okay.
My position on the flood is that there's three mechanisms. I'll give you in a quick shot of it, but the first mechanism is the 40 days of rain, and this is the water vapor, and we'll get the trigger that caused the water vapor to come out of the sky and rain, but it only rained 40 days, 40 nights. The rain was. And then there was the windows of heaven. And some people think they're the same, but they're not. And the reason they're not is the rain lasted 40 days and the windows of heaven lasted 150 days. So they don't last the same amount of time. So they got to be two different mechanisms. The third mechanism is the fountains of the deep, and it lasted 150 days. Now, this 150 days, and for both the windows of heaven and the fountains of the deep, links them together somehow. And of course, the 40 days of rain is different. So we got a situation. I think there's three mechanisms. So we're going to see what triggered the rainfall out of the water vapor, and this would lower the barometric pressure. And I would say that the fountains of the deep are the oceans, and it was pulled out by gravity. I believe a planet, God brought a planet close to the earth, and it uplifted the waters out of the oceans through tidal action. That the flood was mostly tidal in nature. That planet had ice rings, and I believe the scriptures even hint of that, give us evidence of it. And it had ice rings, and the ice rings gave us their ice caps in Antarctica and North Pole, Greenland, and so forth. Any questions? That's in a nutshell.
Yeah. I may not have said my question very well.
So water flowing out of the oceans would not overall change the barometric pressure of the earth. It would still be affected by the planet itself that caused the flood, would affect the atmosphere, and then of course the waters would move around, and the atmosphere would just move with the waters, would adjust as the waters rose and fell. So high places would have a lower barometric pressure, just like they do now. Okay, I'm sorry.
So the ability,
I understand your question.
so the ability to breathe would not be changed much with all this chaos.
Before the flood, I think the barometric pressure was 2, maybe 3 times what it is now. We had hyperbaric conditions. Okay. All right.
Okay, thank you. That does answer the question.
And that's going to explain a bunch of stuff. All right. And I think there's scientific evidence to support that. And it fits with what the Bible says. Okay. All right. So I've given you in a nutshell, but I'm not going to prove these points until later. So we'll develop it as we develop this the flood model. Okay. All right. What we have is if we look at this, is it only rained for 40 days. Genesis 7:12. The rain was on the earth 40 days and 40 nights. See? And it ended, see? I think that's the water vapor coming out of the water, of the skies, out of the atmosphere. And the water prevailed upon the earth 150 days. So the water didn't begin to decrease until 150 days. Now, if it quit raining 110 days before that, the water would go down and level. So there's something else causing this rain, causing this flood other than rain. I think the rain contributed a little bit to the flood, but it was a minor part. The bulk of the flood was caused by tidal action. Since the rain only lasted 40 days, no floodwaters prevailed for 150 days. The rain was a minor part of the cause of the flood. It was there, but it was a minor part. And what it did is it changed the barometric pressure and the atmospheric conditions. And so this really affected man's longevity at that point, and the longevity of animals as well. Okay, questions? If sufficient water vapor were suspended in the atmosphere to double the atmospheric pressure, it would provide about 407 inches of water for each square inch of surface of the earth, 1,034 centimeters for each square meter, okay? Square centimeter. So what we have here is 407 inches of water is not enough to cover the mountains. So you can't get it that way. An average of about 10.17 inches of rainfall each day for 40 days. That's what that would be. And so, again, that's putting out and taking that much out of the atmosphere. With enough water vapor to triple the atmospheric pressure, it would give an average of about 20.34 inches of rainfall each day. 20 inches of rain for each day. That still wouldn't cover the mountains for 40 days. So that would have a triple of the barometric pressure. I think the barometric pressure before the flood was between 2 and 3 times what it is now. And this explains a bunch of stuff that we see in nature and some changes, okay? As we'll develop this, we'll have scientific evidence for what I'm saying, not just from the Bible. We'll combine the two of them. During rainfall, there's not much evaporation because the barometric pressure, the water in the atmosphere the humidity is virtually 100%. So there's not very much evaporation. The rain was not being recycled by evaporation because of this. You don't get much evaporation when it's raining. A steady rain. By faith, Hebrews 11:7, things not seen before the flood. Before the flood, things were different than they are now, or they were after the flood. By faith, so God told him. See, by faith, this came from the word of God. God told Noah, being warned of God concerning things not seen as yet. So what God told him about is things that had never been seen before by man. So what we see is there's something different happening than had happened before the flood. Noah, moved with godly fear, prepared an ark to the saving of his house. He was told something's going to happen. You've never seen it happen. That required faith on his part. And he got evidence from God, prepared an ark to the saving of his house, through which he condemned the world. I say he condemned the people of the world at that time because of his faithfulness to God, his belief in God, became heir of the righteousness, which is according to faith. So he is an heir of the righteousness. We are all descendants of Noah and his 3 sons and their wives, okay, and his wife. Any question? But here are things that are not seen before the flood. Kind of keep that in the back of your mind. Just file that in the back of your mind. Not seen before the flood. Any questions? What happened in the flood had not occurred before, whatever it was. It's something new. And we're going to argue that it had not rained before the flood, no rain before the flood. And no plant of the field was yet in the earth, and no herb of the field had yet sprung up, for Jehovah God had not caused it to rain upon the earth. And there was not a man to till the ground, but there went up a mist from the earth and watered the whole face of the earth. Now here's the situation. The mist would be like a dew, a heavy dew. If we got enough dew on the ground to water the plants, it would be the best way to get water. Why? Because the dew would soak down, water the plants, whereas our rainfall erodes and creates sediment in the streams and other things. It's not the best way to do it. Doing it with a mist or a heavy dew is the best way to water the ground itself. Plants do much better with this, okay? But this changed. So it had been watered by a mist, and then now there had not been any rain but at this time. Man had not seen a rainbow. How do I know that? Because it's a token of God's promise, his covenant, not to send another flood. So how could it be token if it's something they'd already seen before the flood? So the rainbow was new. Whatever caused the rainbow didn't occur before the flood. Genesis 9:13 through 15. I do set my bow in the cloud, that's your rainbow, and it shall be a token of the covenant between me and the earth. So it's not just a token between God and mankind, but the animals as well, the whole earth. It shall come to pass when I bring a cloud over the earth that the bow shall be seen in the cloud. This is what we see. That's what causes the rainbow. You go back and look at that. We'll try to look at this later. And I will remember my covenant, which is between me and you and every living creature of all flesh. So every living creature of all flesh. So this is a promise made not just to Noah, but to animals as well. And the waters shall no more become a flood to destroy all flesh. Now here's the situation. It won't be a flood like this to destroy all flesh. So this flood destroyed all flesh, and there have not been another flood like it. So it's not just a local flood. We've already dealt with that in prior lessons. So questions or comments? Man had not seen clouds before the flood because the rainbow is associated with clouds. So there's not been any clouds. It shall come to pass when I bring a cloud over the earth that the bow shall be seen in the cloud. So the clouds where the bow is linked. Later in this study, we'll consider the physical factors that produce clouds. We'll look at what produces clouds, called cloud condensation nuclei, but we'll look at them later. Now, the Bible clearly tells us the antediluvian humans lived to be nearly 1,000 years old, close to 1,000 years old. A man that died the year of the flood, I think just a month or two before the flood began, Methuselah, was 969 years old. He's the oldest person recorded in the Bible for longevity. Now, there may have been other people that outlived him that just aren't recorded, but he's the oldest one recorded. It's much greater before the flood than after the flood. After the flood, it began to go down. It's likely the animals live longer also. If the mechanism that caused man to live also affected the animals, some of them might live to be 1,000 or even older years, and so live longer also. We're going to develop our evidence for the water vapor canopy model that partially explains the greater longevity of mankind, and my theory that animals also lived a long time at that time. All right, questions or comments? There were other things that were not mentioned in the scriptures before the flood. Now, I want you to know, logically speaking, the fact that the Bible doesn't mention these doesn't mean they didn't occur. I understand that. But the fact that the Bible doesn't mention them will allow us to develop a model that would say they didn't exist before the flood. If my model says they didn't exist, there's no Bible to contradict that model, because the Bible doesn't speak of earthquakes, storms, mountains, or cold weather before the flood. None of this occurred, or is recorded in the Bible, that is. And if my model comes up with this view that these things did not happen before the flood, it won't contradict the Bible. I realize the failure of the Bible to mention these things doesn't prove they did not exist, but it does leave the question open and allows for a model that would postulate that they did not exist. Questions or comments? It provides a mechanism for the 40 days of rainfall. All right. So what we have here is, for yet 7 days, and I will cause it to rain upon the earth 40 days and 40 nights. Every living thing that I've made will I destroy from off the face of the ground. So I'm going to destroy them. So again, most people think the 40 days of rain caused the flood, and that's not in accordance with the Bible itself. A water vapor canopy would allow visible light waves to pass through, but would not allow the longer wavelength heat waves to leave the atmosphere. It would give somewhat of a water vapor canopy would give a greenhouse effect. Same principle which a greenhouse operates. Tompkin claims the greenhouse effect is caused primarily by water vapor. That's what he claims. However, there's a problem with this. They don't know how water vapor will block other kinds of light, and they haven't really, as to my knowledge, they haven't come up with a model that would determine how much extra light would be blocked from getting in. So it wouldn't necessarily be a runaway greenhouse effect. Tompkin claims the greenhouse effect is caused primarily by water vapor. Lubin claims water vapor is the most important greenhouse gas, and the super greenhouse effect is caused by large increase of water vapor. as sea surface temperature increases and the subsequent trapping of infrared radiation. So you'd say, well, are you theorizing a super greenhouse effect? I believe there was a greenhouse effect, but I don't think it was like people are worried about right now. I think I don't think they have evidence to support their claim as to what's going to happen. Seth discussed the mathematical relationship between carbon dioxide and water vapor in the atmosphere and shows they're in a relationship. They're interrelated. They're related to one another. Again, this is all in the book. So water vapor canopy would keep the humidity very high and the temperature almost constant. Such a condition would not create any high winds. Winds are usually the result of differences in temperature. Cold air gets denser and it moves under the warm air, and warm air then moves up. And of course, this occurs and creates fronts moving from the polar regions toward the equator. In the South Pole, they move north. In the North Hemisphere, they move south, generally speaking. Or they move from in a southerly direction. And of course, the spinning of the Earth affects it as well. Coriolis effect. It wouldn't create any high winds, so we wouldn't have high winds because of that. Hollingsworth claims it should be noted that current climatological views favor rather mild, rather uniform temperatures when there were no polar ice caps, more strongly defined zonal climates during glacial periods. So he claims that when there was no ice caps, the Earth was at a very uniform temperature throughout the Earth. We're going to get other information to establish evidence of this in our study as we develop this a little further. On England and Castor state, the warm, equitable climate characteristic of the entire Cretaceous prevailed almost over most of the world. Throughout the Jurassic, this is their periods of time that they've theorized, possibly localized exceptions. The universal tropicality is difficult to explain. Now, see, with their models, they can't explain it. It may be in part attributed as to the Cretaceous and the crisscrossing of continental areas by the warm waters of epieric seas. Epieric is a word meaning upon the land. And the ep is from epi in Greek. However, this cannot explain the warmth in America where epieric seas were very small. Now, again, they are rejecting any of the idea of a flood or anything to that nature. So they have trouble explaining how this happened. Now, how do they know that it was warm in various places all over the world? Well, the fossils show it. The fossils are of animals that animals and plants that require it to be warm. And so this is why they do that, how they determine this. Now, one of the things they've done in Greenland is they've taken the oxygen isotope studies of Greenland, Atlantic, and Russian fossils. And what this is, they have different isotopes. That is, some oxygen atoms have different number of neutrons in the nucleus. And so they have a different weight. And because the ones with more neutrons will weigh more, the oxygen atoms. They're still oxygen because they count the number of protons in the nucleus to make it oxygen. And so these isotopes, and it's from isos, the Greek, and so it's the same. It's the same element, but it has a different weight due to having more protons in the nucleus. I won't spend more time trying to discuss that, but that's basically what we have. And the Cretaceous North Polar water was no colder than 10 degrees to 15 degrees Celsius. Now, in the United States, we don't use Celsius very much. So I'll put this in Fahrenheit. 10 degrees Celsius is 50 degrees Fahrenheit, and 15 is 59 degrees Fahrenheit. So that's the coldest it got up in Greenland, in Russia, at that time, according to these isotopes. And there's probably pretty good evidence from the isotopes. And he explains why this happens, and I don't want to spend the time trying to explain it If you do have questions, bring them up and we'll make a stab at it if you want me to try to explain it later, maybe next week. I want to cover this right here, and I'll stop with this slide. We're about to the end of our period. Well, we might do another slide after this. The presence of great organic reef complexes and rich, very diverse marine fossils in both Silurian and Devonian marine strata suggest warm, shallow, agitated seas. All right. My flood model has the oceans being not as deep as they are now, because the water vapor added about several feet to the oceans, and the windows of heaven also added water to the oceans. So we got extra water. Devonian plants are similar the world over, suggesting that the climate was essentially uniform. These are different fellows coming up with the same conclusion. The climate was uniform throughout the world at this time. The present certainly is not a very good key to the past in terms of climate. He's making a dig at uniformitarianism. He is here in this passage, in this quote. Now, the temperature was probably kept constant by air moving by general convection currents. Now, I remember when I was at the university, my dorm room had steam heat. And what they would do is they had this heater, and steam would come into it, and there was no fan in it, but the hot air rises and it would move to the top of the room and go to the other opposite wall and come down. And it would go in a cycle through the room. Now you couldn't see it, but this is called convection. And this movement of the air itself, and water can move by convection as well, but with moving by a general convection currents. And unobstructed movement of ocean currents as well. And infrared light would come from near the equator being refracted. And of course, the added water vapor would refract it. Now, what is refraction? Well, refraction is when the light encounters or some kind of wave. It can even be a sound wave or other type of waves. When it encounters a medium, it has a different speed. It travels at a different speed going through the medium. And so that's what it basically, when it goes into a medium, it may go faster or slower in that medium. If it goes faster, the part that enters first wraps around the other. It tends to rotate toward it. And so it rotates and changes the movement. And so it looks like it actually, if you look at a spoon, for example, and put a spoonful of a glass with water in it and stick a spoon in the water and look at it from the side, it looks like the spoon is broken. And this is called refraction. And so refraction then would bend the light back and bring it back from the equator, and it could, with enough refraction, bring it back and keep warm in the polar regions as well, due to refracted light. In the radio, people call it skip, but it's primarily refraction. There is some skipping off surface, but it's probably refraction more than it is reflection. Any questions? So infrared light from near the equator would be refracted back to the ground at the lower, in the higher latitudes, as it entered the water vapor canopy due to refraction. Okay. Let's try this one. Large amounts of water vapor would tend to compress the heavier gases, argon, carbon dioxide, nitrogen, oxygen, near the surface of the earth. It would compress it. There's evidence that the relative percent of oxygen in the atmosphere was different in the antediluvian atmosphere than it is now. Increased oxygen would raise the barometric pressure and would affect organisms. Gary Landis in the U.S. Geological Survey measured oxygen in microscopic air bubbles trapped in amber, a fossilized tree resin. He found the amount of oxygen dropped from 35% per 2 million years ago, before the end of the Cretaceous. Today, the oxygen level is 21%. So it was 35% at that time. And there's some other evidence of around 35% from other sources. I theorize the atmosphere then had pre-flood antediluvian atmosphere had 35% oxygen. We're going to stop with that because this is going to be very important for us to explain some other things. But we're giving scientific evidence for this, not just the Bible. Most of this has been scientific. Do you have questions before we stop? All right. Okay, let me get out of it. And we'll stop recording.